The people no one notices are sometimes the ones who change everything. The first sound Ethan Calloway heard was not the applause from hundreds of guests gathered beneath the glittering lights of the Calloway Foundation's annual charity gala. It was the frightened gasp of his 8-year-old son. Then time seemed to forget how to move. Claire Bennett stepped forward without hesitation. Her white apron fluttered for a heartbeat as she reached Noah, wrapping both arms around the boy with the quiet certainty of someone who had already made her choice. A sharp crack echoed across the plaza. Guests froze. Crystal glasses slipped from trembling hands. Music stopped in the middle of a familiar melody. Ethan stood only a few feet away, yet it felt as though an invisible wall had risen between him and the two people at the center of the moment. Claire slowly lost her balance, shielding Noah until security officers rushed forward and guided everyone to safety. Noah's small hands clung tightly to her sleeve, his frightened eyes searching her face. "Miss Claire," he whispered, his voice shaking. She forced the gentlest smile she could manage. "You're okay," she said softly. "That's all that matters." Ethan couldn't move. For the first time in years, the billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking found himself unable to think, unable to speak, unable even to breathe normally. His world had always followed careful plans, calculated risks, and perfect timing. Nothing in that world had prepared him for watching a quiet waitress risk everything to protect the one person he loved more than life itself. Emergency responders arrived within moments. Calm voices replaced panic. Guests stepped aside as Claire was carefully assisted onto a stretcher, still watching Noah to make sure he was unharmed. Ethan finally reached his son, dropping to one knee and pulling the trembling boy into his arms. Noah buried his face against his father's shoulder, but kept looking toward Claire as she was taken away. "Dad," he whispered, "she saved me." Ethan followed the departing ambulance with eyes filled not with fear alone, but with a question that would refuse to leave him. Who was Claire Bennett? She was only a waitress. At least that was what everyone believed. She worked evening shifts at Ashford House, the elegant Manhattan restaurant where executives celebrated mergers, politicians negotiated over steak dinners, and wealthy investors tipped generously without ever learning the names stitched onto black aprons. Ethan himself had eaten there dozens of times. He remembered excellent service, warm coffee, flawless professionalism. He could barely remember the woman who had quietly delivered each meal with calm eyes and an almost invisible smile. Yet somehow she knew his son well enough to move before anyone else understood danger existed. Somehow Noah trusted her enough to run toward her whenever they visited the restaurant. Somehow the person Ethan had overlooked had become the reason his son was still safely in his arms. 3 days earlier, none of that had seemed important. 3 days earlier, Claire Bennett was simply another face hidden behind polished silver trays and polite greetings. 3 days earlier, Ethan Calloway believed he understood exactly how the world worked. 3 days earlier, the morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Ashford House, turning polished silverware into tiny mirrors that reflected warm light across the dining room. Claire Bennett quietly tied the strings of her black apron behind her back before checking every table one last time. Salt shakers stood perfectly centered. Water glasses sparkled without a single fingerprint. Fresh white lilies rested inside crystal vases. She believed people noticed details more than words, even when they never realized it themselves. "Morning, Claire," called Linda, another server carrying a stack of folded napkins. "You are here an hour early again." Claire smiled softly. "It is easier to prepare before the room fills up." Linda laughed. "One of these days you are going to teach the rest of us how you stay so calm." Claire only shrugged. Calm was not something she had learned from books. It had come from years of discovering that panic rarely solved anything. The restaurant slowly awakened as chefs prepared sauces, fresh bread filled the air with its comforting aroma, and coffee began brewing in large silver pots. Every sound blended into a familiar rhythm Claire had grown to love. It was honest work, quiet work, work that reminded her every day that dignity had nothing to do with job titles. Shortly before noon, the manager walked briskly across the dining room with his reservation tablet tucked beneath one arm. "Claire," he said, lowering his voice, "Table 12 is yours today. Mr. Ethan Calloway and his son are coming in for lunch again." Claire nodded politely. "Thank you." The staff usually gets nervous when he visits, the manager admitted. He expects perfection, Claire answered with the same gentle expression she always wore. Everyone deserves our best service. Outside, a black luxury sport utility vehicle stopped beside the entrance. 8-year-old Noah Calloway stepped onto the sidewalk first, wearing a navy sweater despite the warm spring afternoon. His backpack bounced lightly against his shoulders as he looked up at his father with hopeful blue eyes. Ethan ended a business call before placing his phone into his jacket pocket. Even during lunch with his son, billion-dollar negotiations seemed to follow him everywhere. Noah reached for his father's hand without saying a word. Ethan noticed and smiled, the serious businessman disappearing for a brief moment. "Ready for grilled cheese?" he asked. Noah grinned. "Only if Miss Claire is working today." Ethan looked down with mild surprise. "You remember your favorite waitress better than the menu." "She always remembers my hot chocolate without asking," Noah answered proudly. Ethan chuckled quietly as they entered the restaurant. The hostess welcomed them warmly before leading them toward the familiar window table. Claire approached with 2 menus already in her hands. "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway." "Good afternoon, Noah." The boy's face brightened immediately. "Hi, Miss Claire. Would you still like extra marshmallows with your hot chocolate?" she asked. Noah nodded enthusiastically. Ethan looked from his son to Claire with quiet curiosity. She had remembered a small detail from nearly 3 weeks earlier, something even he had forgotten. Before Noah opened his menu, Claire gently reached across the table and moved his water glass a few inches farther from the edge. The movement was almost invisible, so natural that neither father nor son commented on it. A few seconds later, Noah excitedly leaned forward to point at the dessert menu, brushing the exact spot where the glass had been. Claire simply smiled and picked up the crayons she had already placed beside his plate, while Ethan returned to discussing quarterly reports, never realizing that someone had quietly protected a simple moment before anyone else saw it coming. The lunch unfolded with the quiet rhythm that Claire appreciated most. Soft conversations drifted beneath the gentle piano music while sunlight settled across the hardwood floor in long golden lines. Noah happily colored the paper placemat the restaurant provided, carefully drawing a small sailboat floating across an enormous blue ocean. Claire paused beside the table just long enough to admire it. "That looks like it belongs in a museum," she said with genuine warmth. Noah laughed. "It is supposed to be me and Dad on vacation." Ethan glanced at the drawing before looking back to the financial report displayed on his tablet. "We have not taken one in a while," Noah admitted softly. Ethan heard the words, but it took him a moment to answer. "Things have been busy." Claire quietly refilled their water glasses without interrupting the conversation. She had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. As she walked away, she noticed Noah staring through the window instead of finishing his lunch. Children usually smiled when they visited restaurants. This little boy smiled only when someone truly looked at him. Later that afternoon, Ethan stepped outside to answer another business call, while Noah remained inside finishing his dessert. Claire approached with a warm chocolate chip cookie the kitchen had baked only minutes earlier. "Compliments of the chef," she said. Noah's eyes widened. "Really?" Claire nodded. "He said every great artist deserves a reward." Noah smiled before breaking the cookie in half. "Can you share it with me?" Claire hesitated for only a second before accepting the smaller piece. "Thank you." Noah looked toward the window where his father continued speaking into his phone. "My dad works all the time." Claire never rushed to fill quiet moments with easy answers. Instead, she asked gently, "Do you know why?" Noah shrugged. "Because people always need him." Claire folded the paper napkin carefully before placing it beside his plate. "Maybe they do, but I think someone here needs him even more." Noah looked down without replying. Outside, Ethan finally ended the call and remained standing for another minute, watching traffic move through Midtown Manhattan. Every decision he made carried enormous responsibility. Thousands of employees depended on his leadership. Investors trusted his judgment. Board members expected certainty. Ever since his wife Emily passed away 4 years earlier after a sudden illness, work had become both his purpose and his shelter. Success was measurable. Parenting was not. Every evening, he wondered whether he was giving Noah enough of himself. Every morning, he convinced himself he would do better tomorrow. When Ethan returned to the table, Noah was laughing at something Claire had quietly whispered. It was a simple laugh, bright and effortless, the kind Ethan realized he had not heard often enough. Claire stepped back immediately, giving father and son their space as naturally as she had entered it. Ethan reached for the check, but before signing the receipt, he looked toward Claire with thoughtful curiosity. She had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply remembered a favorite drink, encouraged a shy child, and treated every guest with the same steady kindness. Yet somehow the atmosphere around Noah always changed when she was nearby. Ethan could not explain it. He only knew that for the first time in months, his son walked out of the restaurant holding not a tablet or a toy, but a folded drawing and a smile that lingered all the way to the car, while Claire quietly cleared the empty table as though it had been just another ordinary afternoon. The following afternoon arrived wrapped in gentle spring rain that painted the sidewalks of Manhattan with shimmering reflections. Inside Ashford House, the steady sound of silverware and quiet conversation blended with soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers. Claire Bennett welcomed each guest with the same calm smile, never rushing, never pretending, simply making every person feel as though they mattered for a few moments. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the familiar black sport utility vehicle stopped outside once again. Noah spotted the restaurant before his father even turned into the parking area. "She is working today," he said with unmistakable excitement. Ethan smiled faintly. "You can tell from out here?" Noah pointed toward the front window. Claire was carefully helping an elderly couple settle into their seats, patiently adjusting a chair so the gentleman could sit more comfortably. "She always helps people before they ask," Noah replied. Ethan followed his son's gaze. He had never paid attention to such small moments before. Now he watched as Claire quietly carried an extra cushion for the older woman without drawing attention to the gesture. No applause. No expectation of thanks. Just quiet kindness disappearing into the rhythm of another busy afternoon. When father and son entered, Claire greeted them with the same warmth she offered every guest. "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway." "Good afternoon, Noah." Noah reached into his backpack and carefully removed the drawing he had made during their previous visit. "I fixed it," he said proudly. Claire unfolded the paper. The small sailboat now floated beneath a bright blue sky, and beside it stood 3 simple figures smiling together on a wooden dock. "Who is the third person?" she asked gently. Noah looked slightly embarrassed before answering. "It is you. Because Dad smiles more when we come here." Ethan looked at the drawing in silence. Claire blinked once, clearly surprised, before kneeling beside Noah's chair. "That is very thoughtful," she said softly. "But I think your father smiles because he loves spending time with you." Noah looked toward Ethan, whose expression had become unusually quiet. The businessman who could deliver confident presentations before thousands of investors suddenly found no words for a little boy's innocent observation. Throughout lunch, Ethan found himself noticing things he had overlooked dozens of times before. Claire remembered every regular customer's preferences without writing them down. She noticed when a child became restless and quietly brought coloring pages before tears appeared. She refilled coffee cups seconds before they became empty. When a gentleman accidentally dropped his reading glasses beneath the table, Claire had already picked them up before he realized they were gone. Nothing she did seemed remarkable by itself. Together, however, they formed something rare. It was attention, genuine attention. After Noah finished eating, he quietly excused himself to wash his hands. Ethan remained alone at the table as Claire approached with fresh coffee. "Your son is a remarkable young man," she said. Ethan nodded. "He has been through more than most children should." Claire looked toward the hallway where Noah had disappeared. "Sometimes children do not need perfect answers," she said carefully. "They only need to know someone is fully present." Ethan slowly stirred his coffee without drinking it. Those simple words lingered far longer than any business advice he had received that week. Before Claire stepped away, her eyes briefly shifted toward the restaurant entrance. A delivery driver had entered carrying several large floral arrangements for an upcoming charity gala sponsored by the Calloway Foundation. Claire quietly watched the unfamiliar man for only a second before returning to her work, but something almost imperceptible changed in her expression. It was not fear. It was awareness, the kind that noticed details everyone else walked past without a second glance. The charity gala was only 2 days away, and Ashford House had transformed into a quiet center of preparation. Florists moved carefully between tables, Polished brass lanterns lined the entrance, and long white tablecloths were pressed until every fold disappeared. The Callaway Foundation hosted the event every spring to raise money for children's hospitals across New York, and nearly every influential business leader in the city would attend. Claire arrived before sunrise as usual. She preferred the stillness that existed before conversations filled the room. Carrying a tray of coffee toward the ballroom, she noticed the same delivery driver from the previous afternoon speaking with two temporary workers near the loading entrance. Their uniforms matched the event company, yet something about their conversation felt strangely disconnected. One man repeatedly glanced toward the ballroom instead of checking the delivery list in his hands. Another studied the security cameras mounted near the hallway ceiling with unusual interest. Claire continued walking without staring. She had learned that people revealed the most when they believed no one was paying attention. An hour later, while organizing place settings, she discovered one of the emergency exit doors had been propped open with a wooden wedge. Housekeeping normally kept every service entrance secured before major events. Claire quietly removed the wedge and closed the door before informing the banquet manager. He thanked her politely and assumed another employee had simply forgotten. Claire nodded, but the uneasy feeling remained. By early afternoon, Ethan arrived for a planning meeting with the foundation board. Noah came along because school had dismissed early for teacher conferences. The ballroom buzzed with decorators carrying floral arrangements, electricians adjusting stage lights, and volunteers arranging silent auction displays. Noah wandered toward a large model train set that one sponsor had donated for the children's activity corner. Claire noticed him almost immediately. "That looks impressive," she said as she passed with a tray of sparkling water. Noah grinned. "Dad says I can see everything after the meeting." "Then you have something exciting to look forward to," Claire replied. Ethan watched the exchange from across the room before returning to his conversation with board members. He still could not explain why Noah trusted Claire so naturally. Yet every time he saw them together, the anxious expression that often rested on his son's face quietly disappeared. As preparations continued, Claire's attention kept drifting toward small details others overlooked. A decorative equipment case stood several feet farther from the stage than it had earlier that morning. One temporary worker wore an event badge that appeared freshly printed, while everyone else's showed signs of regular handling. Another volunteer seemed unfamiliar with the ballroom layout despite claiming to have worked previous foundation events. None of these observations proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they refused to settle comfortably in her mind. Late that afternoon, the event coordinator announced one final walkthrough before opening night. Guests, volunteers, and sponsors followed the planned route through the ballroom, the reception hall, and finally the outdoor courtyard where children from the hospital would perform a short musical presentation. Claire quietly volunteered to help serve refreshments during the rehearsal, allowing her to remain close to the activity without attracting attention. As she carried a tray toward the courtyard doors, a cool breeze drifted inside. She paused for only a heartbeat. Her eyes moved across the crowd, the security staff, the temporary workers, the stage, and finally to Noah standing beside his father near the front row. Everyone else admired the beautiful decorations. Claire noticed something else. The same unfamiliar worker she had quietly observed all day had changed positions once again, this time standing far closer to the family than his assigned duties seemed to require, and for reasons she could not yet explain, every instinct she had learned to trust whispered that tomorrow's celebration might not unfold as peacefully as everyone expected. The following evening arrived beneath a clear Manhattan sky, and the courtyard of the Callaway Foundation glowed beneath hundreds of warm string lights. Families, donors, physicians, teachers, and business leaders filled the elegant outdoor space with quiet conversation while a children's choir prepared behind the small stage. Laughter drifted through the evening air, blending with soft piano music and the gentle sound of fountains nearby. Claire moved gracefully between guests carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and fresh lemonade, her calm expression never changing even as the crowd grew larger by the minute. Ethan stood near the front of the courtyard greeting donors with practiced confidence, but every few moments his eyes drifted toward Noah, who happily explored the children's activity area with several volunteers. Security officers remained visible throughout the venue, speaking discreetly into radios while monitoring every entrance. To everyone else, the evening appeared flawless. Claire wished she could believe the same. As she crossed the courtyard, she quietly noticed the unfamiliar temporary worker once again. He no longer carried equipment or assisted guests. Instead, he stood unusually still near one of the decorative columns, watching the stage instead of the celebration around him. Claire slowed her pace almost imperceptibly. Years of observing people had taught her that attention always revealed purpose. Everyone else looked toward the children. He looked only toward Noah. A cool breeze brushed across the courtyard. Claire placed her tray onto a nearby serving station without attracting attention and calmly changed direction. At that exact moment, the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone to the evening program. Applause echoed beneath the lights. Ethan stepped toward the podium while Noah wandered a few feet closer to the front row, smiling as the first notes of the choir floated across the courtyard. Claire continued walking, never rushing, never drawing eyes toward herself. Then she noticed one final detail. The unfamiliar worker slipped one hand beneath his event jacket while glancing quickly from Ethan to Noah. Claire did not wait for certainty. Some decisions arrived before thought itself. She crossed the remaining distance with quiet determination, reaching Noah just as startled voices began rising from different parts of the crowd. Claire wrapped both arms around the boy and gently turned him away from the growing confusion, using her own body to shield him while guiding him safely toward the nearest security officer. A sudden sharp sound broke the music, followed almost instantly by another. Guests gasped in surprise as security personnel reacted with remarkable speed, surrounding families and directing everyone toward protected areas with calm, practiced instructions. Ethan spun away from the podium, his heart stopping the instant he saw Claire kneeling beside Noah. She remained focused entirely on the frightened child, gently placing one reassuring hand against his shoulder. "Look at me," she whispered softly. "Take one slow breath. You are safe." Noah obeyed immediately, his frightened eyes locked on hers. Only then did Claire's own strength begin to fade. Ethan reached them within seconds, dropping beside his son before pulling him into a desperate embrace. Noah clung tightly to his father, but kept looking toward Claire with tears filling his eyes. Around them, the courtyard had fallen completely silent. Wealth no longer mattered. Titles no longer mattered. Every guest watched the same extraordinary scene. The quiet waitress everyone had overlooked had thought first of a little boy instead of herself. Ethan stared at Claire in complete disbelief, every carefully constructed certainty about the world dissolving in a single unforgettable moment as emergency responders hurried forward, and the evening that had begun with celebration became the night that would change every one of their lives forever. The ambulance doors closed quietly as flashing lights reflected across the glass walls of Manhattan General Hospital. Inside the emergency department, doctors and nurses moved with calm precision, their steady voices replacing the fear that had filled the courtyard only minutes before. Ethan sat outside the treatment room with Noah asleep against his shoulder, the little boy refusing to let go of his father's hand, even in exhaustion. Every few moments, Noah whispered the same words through half-closed eyes. "Is Miss Claire okay?" Ethan answered each time with the only truth he had. "They are taking good care of her." Yet his own heart refused to believe reassurance until he heard it from a physician. Nearly an hour passed before Dr. Melissa Grant stepped into the waiting area. Her expression carried the quiet confidence of someone delivering hopeful news. "Mr. Calloway," she said gently, "Claire is stable." She remained remarkably calm from the moment she arrived. In fact, she gave our trauma team an incredibly clear assessment of her own condition before we even completed the initial examination. Ethan frowned slightly. Most people would not know how to do that. Dr. Grant nodded. "Exactly." She glanced down at the medical chart in her hands before looking back at him. She identified the safest position to remain in, slowed her own breathing, and even reminded one of our younger nurses to check a secondary vital sign that is sometimes overlooked during high-stress admissions. That is not ordinary knowledge. Ethan remained silent. The woman he had believed was simply an attentive waitress continued becoming someone he no longer understood. A few minutes later, one of the administrative nurses approached carrying Claire's emergency contact information. "Doctor," she said quietly, "there is something else." Dr. Grant reviewed the paperwork before her eyes widened with quiet surprise. She completed almost the entire nursing program at Columbia University Medical Center. Ethan looked up immediately. Almost. According to the records, she left during her final clinical year. The doctor paused. Outstanding academic performance. Excellent evaluations. No disciplinary issues. She simply withdrew. Ethan felt another carefully built assumption disappear. Claire had never mentioned college. She had never hinted at medical training. She had never tried to impress anyone with credentials she no longer used. Noah slowly opened his eyes. Dad. Ethan gently brushed a strand of hair away from his son's forehead. I am here. Can we thank her? The little boy asked. Ethan swallowed before answering. Yes, as soon as she is ready. Meanwhile, inside a quiet recovery room, Claire rested peacefully beneath the soft glow of evening lights. A nurse adjusted her blanket before smiling warmly. You stayed very calm tonight. Claire returned a faint smile. Fear spreads quickly. Calm spreads too. The nurse looked at her chart with curiosity. You could have become an excellent nurse. Claire's eyes drifted toward the window overlooking the city skyline. Life changed. She offered nothing more. She did not mention her mother's long illness, the hospital bills that emptied every savings account, or the decision to leave school so someone else she loved could receive care during her final months. Those memories belonged to her alone. Back in the waiting area, Ethan watched through the small glass window as Claire rested quietly. For years he had measured people by resumes, achievements, and influence. Yet the woman lying inside that room had hidden every accomplishment beneath a simple black apron and had never once asked the world to notice. For the first time in his career, the billionaire realized that the most extraordinary person he had met was someone he had almost failed to see. 2 days later, the first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the hospital window as Claire slowly opened her eyes. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of a heart monitor and the distant footsteps of nurses beginning another shift. She blinked once, adjusting to the soft light, before noticing a small glass vase filled with fresh white lilies resting on the windowsill. There was no card attached. She smiled faintly anyway. She knew exactly who had chosen them. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Dr. Melissa Grant stepped inside, carrying a clipboard. Good morning, Claire. Your recovery is progressing very well. Claire nodded gratefully. Thank you. You have a visitor, the doctor said with a warm smile. Actually, 2 visitors. A few moments later, Ethan entered the room, holding Noah's hand. The little boy's eyes immediately brightened when he saw Claire sitting comfortably against the pillows. Miss Claire, he exclaimed before stopping himself beside the bed. Dad said I have to be careful because you are still healing. Claire laughed softly. Your dad is giving very good advice. Noah carefully placed a folded piece of paper on the blanket. I made this for you. Claire unfolded the drawing. Once again, there was a sailboat floating beneath a bright blue sky, but this time the 3 smiling figures stood together on the shore, and above them Noah had written in uneven handwriting, our hero. Claire looked at the drawing for a long moment before meeting Noah's eyes. I will keep this forever. Ethan stood quietly beside the window, suddenly feeling that every prepared speech he had rehearsed on the drive to the hospital sounded meaningless. Boardrooms had taught him how to persuade investors. Life had never taught him how to thank someone who had changed it forever. Finally, he spoke. Claire, I owe you more than I can ever repay. She gently shook her head. No, you do not. Ethan looked confused. You protected my son. Claire glanced toward Noah before answering. I protected a child. The simplicity of her words settled over the room like morning sunlight. There was no pride in her voice. No expectation. No hint that she believed she had done something extraordinary. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. I have spent years believing that money could solve almost every problem. Claire listened quietly. Now I know there are things wealth cannot buy. Courage, character, the instinct to place someone else before yourself. Claire smiled with quiet kindness. Those things belong to everyone. We simply choose whether to use them. Noah gently reached for her hand. Will you come back to the restaurant? Claire squeezed his fingers lightly. I hope so. Good, Noah replied. Lunch is not the same without you. All 3 of them laughed softly, the sound filling the room with a warmth that no expensive decoration could ever create. Before leaving, Ethan placed a small envelope on the bedside table. Claire looked toward it, but made no move to open it. "It is not money," Ethan explained. "It is simply a letter." After he and Noah quietly left the room, Claire opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper written entirely by hand. It contained no business proposal, no contract, and no promise of rewards. Only one sentence filled the page. "Thank you for reminding me that the greatest strength is not found in power, but in the heart that quietly protects another." Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Noah's drawing, realizing that sometimes the most valuable gifts were not measured in dollars, but in the way a single act of kindness could permanently change another person's soul. 1 month later, the lunch crowd returned to Ashford House with the same familiar rhythm of clinking glasses, quiet conversations, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. To every guest walking through the front door, it looked like any other afternoon in Manhattan. Claire Bennett adjusted the strings of her black apron, greeted the first table with her gentle smile, and carried a pot of fresh coffee through the dining room with the same quiet grace she had always shown. Nothing about her appearance suggested that her life had become the subject of countless conversations across the city. Newspaper headlines had praised an unnamed waitress whose courage protected a child during a charity event, yet Claire had politely declined every interview. Television producers called the restaurant asking for exclusive stories, but she simply thanked them and returned to work. She had never wanted recognition. She had only wanted ordinary days filled with honest work and peaceful evenings. Shortly after noon, the familiar black sport utility vehicle stopped outside once again. Noah stepped onto the sidewalk first, smiling before he even reached the entrance. "She is here," he said happily. Ethan looked through the front window and saw Claire arranging fresh lilies on a nearby table. For a brief moment, he remained still, remembering the first time he had walked into this restaurant, believing he understood exactly who she was. Now he realized he had never known her at all. As father and son entered, Claire welcomed them with the same warm voice she had always used. "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway." "Good afternoon, Noah." There was no awkwardness, no expectation, no reminder of what had happened. Only kindness. Noah handed her a small paper bag decorated with colorful markers. "I made blueberry muffins with my grandmother yesterday," he said proudly. "These are for you." Claire accepted the bag with genuine delight. "Then I already know they will be delicious." Ethan smiled as he watched the exchange. Before sitting down, he quietly walked to the empty chair at the table and gently pulled it back for Claire. She looked surprised. "Mr. Calloway?" He shook his head with a grateful smile. "Please." "It is Ethan." Claire hesitated only a moment before taking the seat. Around the dining room, several guests paused their conversations. Not because a billionaire had entered the restaurant, but because they had never seen one treat a waitress with such natural respect. Ethan did not notice the curious glances around him. For the first time in many years, he no longer cared what anyone expected from him. Noah happily placed his latest drawing on the table. The familiar sailboat floated across calm blue water once again, but this time the three figures stood beneath a bright lighthouse. Across the top of the page he had written, "Real heroes help people shine." Claire's eyes softened as she carefully folded the drawing beside the first one she still carried inside her locker. Lunch passed with easy conversation, quiet laughter, and long moments that needed no words at all. As Ethan and Noah prepared to leave, Ethan paused beside the doorway and looked back toward Claire. She had already returned to serving another table with the same patience she offered everyone else. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek attention. She simply continued making ordinary moments brighter for strangers who often never realized the gift they had received. Ethan finally understood that greatness rarely announced itself. It quietly appeared in people who chose compassion when no one was watching. As sunlight poured through the restaurant windows, Claire carried another cup of coffee to another waiting guest, and the world continued moving forward exactly as before. Only one thing had truly changed. A billionaire no longer saw a waitress when he looked at her. He saw the quiet strength that had restored not only his son's safety, but the humanity inside his own heart. Sometimes the bravest people wear aprons instead of armor, and the strongest souls never ask to be remembered because the kindness they leave behind remembers them for everyone else.